Applied Linguistics Group uploaded this video for BS English students. Dr. Khalid Malik, the founder, has a PhD in Applied Linguistics TESOL. Having more than 25 research papers, he taught at many foreign universities and in a postdoctoral study program. Join Applied Linguistics Group at youtube.com/@1966Pakistani or use a QR code to join our Facebook group at
BS English, Level, BS 8 Semester Course Code, ELL 408, Introduction to Translation Studies. Question number 11. Postcolonial Theories of Translation by Dr. Khalid Malik, PhD Applied Linguistics. Postcolonial Translation Theory. In Translation and Gender, Sherry Simon's focus centers on underlining the importance of the cultural turn in translation. In the conclusion, she insists on how contemporary feminist translation has made gender the site of a consciously transformative project, one which reframes conditions of textual authority, 1996, 167, and summarizes the contribution of cultural studies to translation as follows. Cultural studies brings to translation an understanding of the complexities of gender and culture. It allows us to situate linguistic transfer within the multiple post-realities of today: post-structuralism, post-colonialism and postmodernism. Simon 1996, 136. In recent years it is in fact post-colonialism that has attracted the attention of many translation studies researchers. Though its specific scope is sometimes undefined, post-colonialism is generally used to cover studies of the history of the former colonies, studies of powerful European empires, resistance to the colonialist powers and, more broadly, studies of the effect of the imbalance of power relations between colonized and colonizer. The consequent crossover between different contemporary disciplines can be seen by the fact that essays by Simon and by Lefebvre appear in collections of post-colonial writings on translation, and Simon herself makes extensive reference to the post-colonialist Spivak. In particular, Simon highlights, pp. 145-7, Spivak's concerns about the ideological consequences of the translation of Third World literature into English and the distortion this entails. Spivak has addressed these questions in her seminal essay, The Politics of Translation, 1993-2004, which brings together feminist, post-colonialist and post-structuralist approaches. Tensions between the different approaches are highlighted, with Spivak speaking out against Western feminists who expect feminist writing from outside Europe to be translated into the language of power, English. Such translation, in Spivak's view, is often expressed in a translatise, which eliminates the identity of politically less powerful individuals and cultures. In the act of wholesale translation into English, there can be a betrayal of the democratic ideal into the law of the strongest. This happens when all the literature of the Third World gets translated into a sort of with it translatise, so that the literature by a woman in Palestine begins to resemble, in the feel of its prose, something by a man in Taiwan. Spivak, 1993-2004, 371-2. Spivak's critique of Western feminism and publishing is most biting when she suggests, page 379, that feminists from the hegemonic countries should show real solidarity with women in post-colonial contexts by learning the language in which those women speak and write. In Spivak's opinion, the politics of translation currently gives prominence to English and the other hegemonic languages of the ex-colonizers. Translations into these languages from Bengali too often fail to translate the difference of the Bengali view because the translator, albeit with good intentions, over-assimilates it to make it accessible to the Western readers. Spivak's own translation strategy necessitates the translator's intimate understanding of the language and situation of the original. It draws on post-structuralist concepts of rhetoric, logic and the social. Spivak's work is indicative of how cultural studies, and especially post-colonialism, has over the past decade focused on issues of translation, the transnational and colonization. The linking of colonization and translation is accompanied by the argument that translation has played an active role in the colonization process and in disseminating an ideologically motivated image of colonized peoples. a parallel which feminist theorists have drawn between the conventional male-driven depiction of translations and of women. So has the metaphor been used of the colony as an imitative and inferior translational copy whose suppressed identity has been overwritten by the colonizer. Translation's role in disseminating such ideological images has led Basnett and Trivedi, 1999, 5, to refer to the shameful history of translation. Through by an absentee colonialism, Niranjana 1992, 8. She sees literary translation as one of the discourses, the others being education, theology, historiography and philosophy, which inform the hegemonic apparatuses that belong to the ideological structure of colonial rule, page 33. Niranjana's focus is on the way translation into English has generally been used by the colonial power to construct a rewritten image of the East that has then come to stand for the truth. She gives other examples of the colonizer's imposition of ideological values. These vary from missionaries who ran schools for the colonized and who also performed a role as linguists and translators, to ethnographers who recorded grammars of native languages. Niranjana sees all these groups as participating in the enormous project of collection and codification on which colonial power was based, page 34. She specifically attacks translation's role within this power structure. Translation as a practice shapes, and takes shape within, the asymmetrical relations of power that operate under colonialism. Niranjana 1992, 2. Colonial power to construct a rewritten image of the East that has then come to stand for the truth. She gives other examples of the colonizer's imposition of ideological values. These vary from missionaries who ran schools for the colonized and who also performed a role as linguists and translators, to ethnographers. Furthermore, she goes on to criticize translation studies itself for its largely Western orientation, and for three main failings that she sees resulting from this, pp 48-9. 1. That translation studies has until recently not considered the question of power imbalance between different languages. 2. That the concepts underlying much of Western translation theory are flawed, its notions of text, author, and meaning are based on an unproblematic, naively representational theory of language. 3. That the humanistic enterprise of translation needs to be questioned, since translation in the colonial context builds a conceptual image of colonial domination into the discourse of Western philosophy. Niranjana writes from an avowedly post-structuralist perspective. This overlapping is indicative of the interaction of different aspects of cultural studies, and of the way in which they interface with translation studies. It also informs Niranjana's recommendations for action, which are 1. In general, that the post-colonial translator must call into question every aspect of colonialism and liberal nationalism, page 167. For Niranjana, this is not just a question of avoiding Western metaphysical representations, it is a case of dismantling the hegemonic West from within, deconstructing and identifying the means by which the West represses the non-West and marginalizes its own otherness, page 171. In this way such repression can then be countered. 2. Specifically, Niranjana calls for an interventionist approach from the translator. I initiate here a practice of translation that is speculative, provisional and interventionist, she proclaims, page 173, in her analysis of translations of a spiritual Vakana poem from southern India. She attacks existing translations, including one by the celebrated A. K. Ramanujan, as attempting to assimilate Saivite poetry to the discourses of Christianity or of a post-romantic new criticism, page 180, analogous to 19th-century native responses to colonialism. Her own suggested translation resists the containment of colonial discourse by, amongst other things, reinscribing the name of the poet's god Guharesvara and the Linga representation of light, and by avoiding similes that would tone down the native form of metaphorization, pp 182-6. Asymmetrical power relationships in a post-colonial context also form the thread of the important collection of essays entitled Postcolonial Translation, Theory and Practice, edited by Susan Bassnett and Harish Trivedi, 1999. In their introduction, page 13, they see these power relationships being played out in the unequal struggle of various local languages against the one master language of our post-colonial world, English. Translation is thus seen as the battleground and exemplification of the post-colonial context. There is a close linkage of translational to transnational, the latter term referring both to those post-colonials living between nations as emigrants, as in the example of Salman Rushdie, described in Baba 1994, and, more widely, as the locational disruptor that describes the situation of those who remain in the melting pot of their native site. In current theoretical discourse, then, to speak of post-colonial translation is little short of tautology. In our age of the valorization of migrancy, exile and diaspora, the word translation seems to have come full circle, and reverted from its figurative literary meaning of an interlingual transaction to its etymological physical meaning of locational disruptor. Translation seems to have been translated back to its origins. Bassnett and Trivedi 1999, 13. Crucial, here, are the interrelated concepts of in-betweenness, the third space, and hybridity, and cultural difference, which post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha uses to arise questions of identity, agency, and belonging in the location of culture. Bhabha 1994. For Bhabha, the discourse of colonial power is sophisticated and often camouflaged, but its authority may be subverted by the production of ambivalent cultural hybridity that allows enunciative space for the discourse of the colonized to interrelate with it and thus undermine it. The consequences for the translator are crucial. As Michaela Wolff, 2142, states, the translator is no longer a mediator between two different poles, but his activities are inscribed in cultural overlappings which imply difference. More recent work on colonial difference, by Sotia Rao, 2006, challenges Bhabha's view that post-colonial translation is subversive. Rao proposes the term non-colonial translation theory, which considers the original as a radical immanence indifferent to the colonial world and therefore untranslatable into it. Page 89. This calls for a radically foreign performance or non-translation. The contributions contained in Bassnett and Trivedi's book show that post-colonial translation studies take many forms. Several chapters are based on the theory and practice of translation from an Indian perspective. Indian literary traditions are essentially traditions of translation, says Devi, 1999, 187, and studies are included of the work of renowned translators B. M. Srikanthaiah, Viswanatha and Simon 1999, and A. K. Ramanujan, Darwadkar 1999. In the latter case, Darwadkar reacts against Niranjana's attack on Ramanujan, stating that Ramanujan had worked from an earlier and different version of the poem, that Niranjana ignores the translator's commentary on the poem, and that the goal of the translation was to orient the Western reader to cross-cultural similarities.
Applied Linguistics Group uploaded this video for BS English students. Dr. Khalid Malik, the founder, has a PhD in Applied Linguistics TESOL. Having more than 25 research papers, he taught at many foreign universities and in a postdoctoral study program abroad. Join Applied Linguistics Group at youtube.com/@1966Pakistani or use a QR code to join our Facebook group at